Question number 5, Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister responsible for Housing New Zealand Corporation. How does he anticipate Housing New Zealand will operate within a contestable market for social housing?
Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I expect that they will participate successfully, but development of a contestable market is still some way off. MSD currently holds around 62,000 income-related rent subsidies. From now on, a tenant can take that subsidy with them to a provider who best meets their housing, health and employment needs, or offers a better wraparound services where those are required, or a better path back to housing independence. Housing New Zealand will find in a contestable market that it will be required to develop the similar kind of services. I expect that for quite a long time they will remain by far the largest provider of social houses.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Phil Twyford.
Is he aware that social housing NGOs say that they do not have the resources to buy state houses? And how will he make up the difference between the likely sale prices and the funds that he's signalled will be spent on his government's pet projects and his other political promises?
Honourable Bill English, either of those questions.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm sure there are some community housing providers who feel like they wouldn't have the resource to buy the houses, but then they won't be obliged to. As long as they're registered as a community housing provider, they can work with others who own the houses and they can participate in this market without the need for large lumps of capital. And I'd expect they will be providers who are most motivated, for instance, by wraparound services for the most complex clients, who could actually get a better deal there than they currently get, or for new clients who aren't in housing corp houses but have serious housing need to be met. With respect to the funding issues the member raised, I'm not exactly sure what he means, so I can't answer the question.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Jami-Lee Ross.
What reports has he received on the operation of contestable social housing markets overseas, and what does this say about Housing New Zealand's role?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, New Zealand is a bit unusual in the way that we have run our traditional state housing. The Housing Shareholders Advisory Group report in 2010 pointed to a number of similar countries who run social housing markets. For instance, in the Netherlands there are 400 housing associations. In Canada the Crown specialises in financial support rather than the provision of houses, and there's a much more diverse range of housing providers. In the UK and Australia there are now large alternative providers to governments who are doing a very good job of operating as mixed entities. Here in New Zealand, we expect that Housing New Zealand will continue to play a major role alongside community providers, but they will no longer be the only provider.
Supplementary question, Phil Twyford.
Was he offended when his Cabinet colleague Paula Bennett this morning launched an attack on his failed housing policies when she said that sending people to live in caravans, cars and garages, as his department has been doing for the last 6 years, was not suitable?
They did it under Labour as well.
Order. Honourable.
Well, Mr Speaker, no, I wasn't offended. In fact, I had a discussion with Ms Bennett along these lines. If you wanted to house an extra 1,000 people under the traditional model, it cost you $500 million to build the houses and would take 5 years. Under the new model, if you want to house an extra 1,000 people, it will cost $12 million a year in income-related rents, because there are 12,000 a year each in Auckland. And if the houses are available across the whole market, you could do it within a matter of months. Surely that is a better system for dealing with people living in caravans and garages.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Phil Twyford.
Was he concerned when the Treasury warned the government that it's not possible to provide social housing at a profit, and when they advised exploring, and I quote, how we can unlock the potential of Housing New Zealand's asset base, unquote? Was he concerned that that advice suggested that the only way to develop an artificial marketplace in social housing was to flog off state houses at knockdown prices to make it look viable?
That's what they're doing.
Honourable Bill English.
Well, again, I'm not sure if the member either understood the advice. Certainly, if I don't recall the advice being put in exactly that way. The government is right and is in the provision of subsidises social housing very extensively. We spend $1.2 billion on accommodation supplements, $700 million a year on income-related rents, and we simply want to do a better job of it, because despite spending $2 billion a year in subsidies, there are thousands of people in serious housing need whose needs are not being met, and thousands of people in state houses who should be on a path to independence but are in long-term dependency. We care about the people more than the houses, and that's the difference between us and the Labor Party, who care more about state houses than people with serious housing needs.
Supplementary.
Order. 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 Supplementary question, Phil Twyford.
Isn't it nonsense to talk about a market in social housing when it's impossible to even enter the market without a massive taxpayer subsidy and virtually giving away public assets? And why did the government deliberately conceal from the public at the election its plans to destroy a Kiwi institution that has been housing struggling families and giving young New Zealanders like the Prime Minister a decent start in life?
Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, the irony of that comment is that when we passed the Social Housing Reform Act, the Labor Party used to be progressive because they voted for that in 2013, which is where all this was laid out and debated. So it was hardly a secret. But clearly, in the interests of their leadership contest, they're reverting to their 1960s notions of state housing.
Question number 6. Order. Order. Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I want to draw your attention to Speaker's Ruling 179/3 with regard to the correction of answers, because we have a situation where the Prime Minister gave a very specific answer in answer to Annette King's supplementary question, and she has subsequently tabled information showing that that answer was incorrect. And I wonder whether he will be now taking the opportunity to correct that.
Order. As the member has had explained to him before, if any member, minister in answering a question, feels he wants to correct that answer, then it's the responsibility of the Prime Minister or the Minister to decide when to do that. The member is right, it should certainly be done at the earlier convenience, but it's not a matter for this House, it's for the matter, in this case, for the Prime Minister if he sees it necessary.
I will hear from the Prime Minister, but I have actually the answer I gave was, well, assumed the question was in relation to the passing of information about a public servant. That is not a matter for the inquiry, as I understand it. The information in relation to Mr Feely is absolutely a subject of inquiry, but I took the member's question to be as a completely different accusation.
Order. Point of order, Honourable Annette King.
Mr Speaker, perhaps we could clear it up if I was to repeat the question, because the Prime Minister obviously didn't hear my question and made his answer.
Order. If the member wasn't satisfied with the answer, she had the opportunity at the time to raise another supplementary. We've moved well past question number 2. I'm now calling question number 6. Chris Bishop.
Mr Speaker, my question is